So, did you think that human minds and divine inspiration are the geniuses behind theology and the history of ideas? Maybe you should listen to this and think again. In 1740, a guy called Abraham Tremblay found a little jelly thingy, a little polyp in a pond in Holland. And he decided to examine this creature, and thus he secured his place in the history books. Because this little creature, not only did it have the habits of an animal while it was a plant, it was also able to regenerate when cut in two. The scientists were stunned, but that is nothing compared to the interest from theologians and philosophers. Because if the polyp was indeed an animal, and if it was divisible, then this animal's soul was actually divisible along with its body, which in turn meant that this animal could not be preformed by God. It did not support the idea of a preformed divine plan, but suggested a transformation theory. Not a preformation theory, but a transformation theory. Things could perhaps actually transform. Things could transform without God. And if so, what happened with divine power? What happened with church power? The polyp also challenged another prevalent idea at the time, namely the chain of being. That is roughly the idea of an order present in nature, structuring the material world, where the world of dead matter is at the bottom, then the world of plants, then animals, then humans, women of course slightly below men, and on top divine being itself. Now we must understand that many scientists were theologically motivated. Friedrich Christian Lesse, for instance, he studied nature to understand the divine plan, and to Lesse the chain of being was established by God, and anyone suggesting otherwise was to Lesse a materialist and a transformist. Naturally, the jelly thingy from the pond was precisely that. It was a materialist, it was a transformist, it challenged Lesse's worldview completely. And this is why the polyp was nothing less than the talk of the town. Or as Riemer wrote, if people in Paris did not talk too much about the war at present, they would be talking only about the insect which, being cut in two, become complete animals. Now, the poor pious Lesse was drawn into the debate when the translator added a commentary to one of his books. The translator simply stated that if one took Lesse's observation seriously, one must admit that the souls of some animals are indefinitely divisible, and if the animal soul is divisible, well, perhaps the same goes for the human soul, and perhaps humans are simply animals, and perhaps their soul are one with their materiality. No body versus soul dualism, but instead an entanglement of sorts. Well, unorthodoxy and plain heresy. The multiplying ability of the polyp suggested transformism rather than preformism, and if the chain of being actually did include a species that could multiply, and that also did not belong to one realm but to two, it was a plant and an animal, then suddenly this chain of being appeared more like a chain of transformative becoming than one of stable being. The polyp was a materialist, it was a transformist, and by its very existence and in its authority as study object, it did have quite a bit of influence. So this polyp was an outrage, it was a scandal, and so it took one fearless, scruple-free author and thinker to take on the challenge of actually drawing out the philosophical and theological consequences of the polyp's existence. This someone was Julien Offray-Lamétrie, and the result of his endeavour was published in 1747 in a little pamphlet that made him later have to flee the country. But the polyp had already had its say. and Western theology and philosophy was never the same again after its appearance.